Well, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm pleased today to be hosting our latest installment of the AVERT webinar series. And for this presentation, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Imogen Richards, who is going to be talking to us about her new book. A book came out last year, The Far Right and the Environment in Australia, a summary analysis and discussion of global heating and the Australian far right. Before we start, just a acknowledgement, as is customary in Australia, that of the traditional owners on the lands in which we meet. In my case, it's the land of the Wurundjeri people, and I pay my respect to their elders, past and present. A couple of housekeeping, which is as usual for our webinar series. Dr. Richards will be giving us a presentation, and then there'll be room for Q&A. Please put all your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar, and we'll do a moderated Q&A after Imogen finishes her presentation, which I'm very excited about. I've been wanting to get my hands on this book and hear more about it, because I think this issue around issues around the environment, I think, is impacting a lot of our studies in extremism in ways unexpected and maybe expected. And so I think that we'll get some great insights from this presentation. I know it certainly impacts some of the work and the projects that I'm working on. So I'm really excited to hear from Imogen, because the book examines the contemporary environmental politics of Australian far-right actors and movements. And it also focuses on the wider political context in which they operate and their response to global heating and the impacts that it's having on violent extremism. So just a brief introduction of Imogen. Many of you, she's well known to many of you. I'm happy to call her a friend and a colleague as well. She's a lecturer in criminology at Deakin University. Her research focuses on social, news, and alternative forms of online media. She writes about the political economy of counterterrorism, the performance of security in response to terrorism and crises, and lately, of course, this work on extremism and the environment. So I want to make sure that we have as much time as we can to hear from Imogen. So Imogen, off to you. Thanks so much.
Okay, great. Thank you, Lydia, and thanks, Nell, as well. Okay, just bear with me. Okay. So I think that is working now, screen sharing. Yep. All right, so thanks everyone for coming along. Let me just double check that is working, sorry. Sorry, Lydia, can I just double check you can see the PowerPoint?
Yep, we can see everything great, yep.
Great, sorry. Great, anyway, so thank you everyone for coming along. So in this presentation, I'm going to cover really just some of the key insights from a book that was co-authored by me and Gerard Brin and Callum Jones, who were at the time PhD students at Monash University and the University of Melbourne. So rather than try to cover everything, I'm just going to instead focus on a few key insights. I think, sorry, I'm just getting a bit of reverb. I think, Lydia, if you're able to mute, yeah, thanks. All right, so first I just wanted to show you a breakdown of the chapters in the book. So through these chapters, the book attempts to trace the development of far-right pseudo-environmentalism and territorial politics stemming from colonial genocide, really focusing on federation and ideas around territorial politics from then, into different forms of Australian nationalism and ultranationalism, and then into more of the contemporary context with extreme right political violence. So it uses a critical discourse analysis, really, of news and social media, as well as a wider documentary analysis with some sort of mixed methods components to try to reveal how denialist and resignatory attitudes toward climate change can actually operate alongside what we sometimes call extreme right accelerationism. And we also, as Lydia mentioned, sought to contextualize in the Australian context how this occurs within a wider political environment, which has had elements of sort of reactionary, different types of right-wing politics in respect of fossil fuels and climate change response, and also wider neoliberal new right economic agendas. So we also address the wider global political ideological context of the contemporary far right, and this involved looking at intergovernmental approaches to security threats connected to the far right and climate change, as well as the emergence of what are sometimes called sort of radical environmentalist traditions in so-called new catastrophism literature. So the conclusion of the book then seeks to try to synthesize some of the key insights, analysing particularly the mainstreaming function of the discourses we've looked at, and the mainstreaming of ethno-nationalist and authoritarian responses to global heating. Okay. Excuse me. So a key aim of the book was really to interpret the historical environment from which contemporary further right-wing attitudes as well toward the environment in Australia can emerge. So in showing how climate change denialism and resignatory attitudes operate alongside climate change accelerationism, we also sought to acknowledge the enduring influence of the country's settler colonial history. So contemporary right-wing attitudes toward the Australian environment and territories are partly predicated on the construction of the Australian legend, which I can speak about more in the Q&A if that's helpful, but also with reference to sort of extractivist uses of the land, which have been prevalent and evolving in different forms since colonisation. So to understand as well the context in which these white nationalist and white supremacist ideologies developed about the Australian territories and environment, it is important to reflect on this settler colonial history. So as we know, this history was characterised by the systemic genocide of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So partly in this first analysis chapter, we highlighted how when Britain, for example, first established the first penal colony in Australia at Botany Bay in Sydney in 1788, there were estimated to be over 750,000 Indigenous people in the country. As members of the world's oldest continuous culture, they had been living in Australia for at least 65,000 years. And then only approximately 60,000 Indigenous people remained by 1920 after enduring illness, disease, and more than 400 systematic frontier massacres. So in the period 1910 to 1970, under assimilationist policies, an estimated 100,000 Indigenous children were also forcibly removed from their families, and they were placed into adoption, foster care, or children's homes as part of the stolen generation. So in the contemporary Australian context, ongoing state-based disparities and oppression has resulted as well in more than 470, I think more than 500 now, Indigenous people dying in custody since the 30th anniversary of the 1991 Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody. So knowledge of the treatment of Indigenous people in connection with country as well by Australian European settlers was effectively erased from many official accounts of the country's political history. And that included routinely in school curricula and in the media until recent decades. So this historical amnesia enabled the reimagining of the Australian landscape as terra nullius, meaning an empty land available for settlement. Excuse me. It also enabled the justification of environmental and territorial policies and politics that would privilege settler or colonial interests over Indigenous ones. So the enduring influence of settler colonial mentalities is also related to Australia's, the development of the Australian legacy and its historical status as a British colony and a penal colony for England. So these histories had a profound impact on the settlers' relationship with both the British Empire and the local environment. So, for example, an initial founding narrative contributed to the development of a unique Australian identity in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which was largely in representation of the challenges faced by working class British and Irish migrant settlers. This identity was characterised by a rejection of British colonialism and a desire for independence. It was centred around archetypes like the Bushman and the larrikin, related to sort of the taming of a wild landscape, but also ideals such as self-reliance, independence, and egalitarianism. But exclusively, these were afforded to able-bodied, heteronormative white men. So another significant element of the founding ideology for colonial Australia were romanticised identities, which were rooted in the logics of capitalist resource exploitation. So once again, these reflected the dispossession of Indigenous peoples, and they also informed prevalent current social attitudes toward the environment over time. And ideologically, they related to the ability to exert control and ownership over territories, where resource extractivism was driven by sort of accumulation incentives and development incentives, and the desire, again, to derive economic and social uses and profits from the land. So, as happened elsewhere as well, white nationalist values were variously buttressed by wilderness myths and these ideas of Western civilization or civilizationism. So the environment was deployed as part of a sort of mythic colonial narrative on the part of organisations which we might now classify as far right, owing to their various anti-Semitic, ultra-traditionalist, fascist, or white supremacist elements. So just briefly, to go through some of the examples and types of far-right political organisations that emerged over those years. So in the interwar period, we saw radical nationalist literary groups, which were connected with the original anti-Semitic and pro-Hitlerite Australia First movement in the interwar years. And that was then a forerunner to later radical nationalist political parties, including the Australia First Party of the same name. And these early, though, interwar literary movements in particular attempted to sort of reconcile blood and soil tropes for the Australian context. And so this included through such specific ideas as appropriating Indigenous imagery and themes, including through this group called the Jindi Warrabak Literary Group, which was run out of the University of Adelaide. So after World War II, we saw the emergence of the Australian League of Rights, which became the longest standing far-right organisation in Australia's, or white nationalist anti-Semitic organisation in Australia's political history. So it espoused conspiracies about East Asian and Indigenous people. It was strong on anti-urban attitudes and anti-Semitic attitudes, as I said, as well as professing strong and advocating strong British Empire loyalism. But this organisation, for example, also attempted to make incursions into the post-World War II organic movement in Australia, and that was deriving influence a lot from the early organic movement and the sort of far-right or white supremacist and anti-Semitic incursions that were happening in the UK. Okay, so I can come back to some of the later examples, but just to jump ahead, after contextualising this earlier history, we sought to look at some of the ideological developments on the far right in the more present day. So in this next chapter, we looked at the discourse of the extreme right, particularly National Socialist activists, and we examined, particularly through looking at online platforms like Gab, Telegram, Facebook and Stormfront, how Australia's colonial history is evoked again directly and also in a fairly unvarnished manner. One group that we looked at called itself the Australian Nativists Association and had sort of was more marginal in size, but was belonging to a wider ecosystem and was an interesting example of the leverage of these sort of colonial tropes. But they were also, that is to say, prevalent across the Telegram media, in particular of the National Socialist Network and its partner organisation, the European Australian Movement. But for example, the Australian Nativists Association, we looked at its Facebook page, and that name was taken from the original Mutual Society in Australia, which was founded in 1871. And its members included Australia's first Prime Minister, Edmund Barton, as well as later Prime Ministers like Alfred Deakin, James Scullin, and Francis Ford. And also influential among the groups that we looked at across these different channels were the sort of pseudo-environmentalist tendencies, or the stated environmentalist tendencies, I should say, of white supremacist mass attackers. So that included in the statements of Brenton Tarrant, who was the Australian perpetrator of the massacre at 2 mosques in Christchurch in 2019, who called himself an eco-fascist. So while Tarrant drew on the discussion of populationist or population reduction arguments in the so-called manifesto of the neo-Nazi Anders Breivik, who perpetrated the mass attack in Norway in 2011, Brenton himself then went on to inspire several other violent actors across the US and Europe who would refer to him as Saint Tarrant, and including, for example, in the so-called manifesto of the person who perpetrated the mass shooting at a supermarket in Buffalo, targeting Black people, who had a very extended tract about green nationalism in his manifesto. But a final point that I would emphasize here is to highlight the ways in which statements in support of Tarrant and other such violent actors would occur alongside the prominent feature of environmental landscapes and imagery. But in understanding how far and extreme right propaganda of this type works, it's also important, I think, not to view these contemporary discourses as divorced from the wider media ecosystems in which they circulate. So of particular interest in our study were the ways in which climate change denialism in sort of far-right online spaces like the Gab Australia page featured alongside resignatory responses to climate change and accelerationist attitudes. So, for example, with positive reference to cases of suffering by climate devastation on the part of people in the Global South, or in the 2019-2020 Black Summer bushfires in Australia. So in this sense, we argued that it's important to recognise the relevance of what's sometimes called the post-truth era here, where what we can understand as sort of Nietzschean, so inspired by sort of Friedrich Nietzsche's ideas of perspectivism, combine with what we also termed neoliberal instrumentalism. And this is basically a utilitarian approach to propaganda and political communications, such that truth is really only valued to the extent of its political material use. So too often still, I think, people might tend to believe that the propaganda of these types of neo-fascists represent genuine political commitments, or they take them at their word to try to get at what they really think, but particularly in respect of the social currents that these activists, these far-right activists see as useful, including environmentalism and leveraging different types of climate change responses. I think it's important to look at the utilitarian nature of information in the sense of they're going with what works. So the currents of environmentalism expressed by these white supremacists are usually deployed in the service of re-enshrining what they see as most likely to deliver outcomes favourable to white supremacism. So, but that said, natural environmental imagery and tropes were also incorporated into narratives which were more broadly based around sort of social Darwinist ideas, speciesist ideas, viewing migrants as a foreign species, for example, and natural hierarchies. So blood and soil ideas, particularly along with land and place connection, are important in the communicating the worldview of particularly ideas, far-right activist ideas around ethnocultural separatism, sort of the forced separation of cultures and people, and in response to climate change, advocating things like authoritarian sort of ethno-states, and the ideas of remigration, the idea of the repatriation of regular and irregular migrants back to their alleged ancestral homelands. So Australian actors do have some crossovers with international cases of what we could call sort of fascist greens rather than green fascists. So there are examples of that, even though that's not the type of thing that I'm looking at with respect to National Socialists here, that we were looking at in the book as much. But in those cases, you know, extreme right actors have made incursions into environmental movements, or anti-immigration and sort of radical traditionalist or eugenicist ideas have become more prevalent. So these, in terms of organised activists, these types of ideological currents aren't as prevalent here as they perhaps are already elsewhere, but I think that's an interesting space to watch as it develops. So some of those links tie into the sort of attempted ideas of the sort of self-described national anarchists, which were crossing over with the now National Socialist network type type people and modes of political organization, but that was through the sort of early 2000s. Also ideas around third positionism and the sort of pseudo, Eurasianist ideas as well, and various autonomous movements, which are quite prevalent in different parts of Germany, across Europe, as well as in the US as well. So there are international connections there. And if you're looking at sort of the propaganda put out by Jim Salim, who was in a leadership position in the Australia First Party, and obviously a long-standing National Socialist, neo-Nazi activist and organizer and leader in Australia, there's a lot of usage of third positionist ideas and literature in that context. But that is to say, less prevalent in the overt organising of groups in Australia than elsewhere. Okay, so in the next chapter, and really throughout subsequent parts of the book, we moved on to examine how the conspiratorial and violent narratives of extreme right actors in alternative online spaces can share circular relationships with news media. And this was particularly evident, again, with the case of the Black Summer bushfires. So that is, climate change denialism in response to the bushfires was particularly prevalent across alternative news media, across discussions on things like the Stormfront Australia fora and other far-right social media, but also in mainstream news media, and particularly the sort of famous denialism of the climate change driving factors behind those bushfires, which were sort of repeated and circulated in Murdoch-owned media, particularly News Corporation. So these news articles and related commentary was circulated in mainstream media, but also in alternative and mainstream social media, where they were picked up, and these news reports were leveraged by far-right actors, gaining greater nuance and then sort of developing conspiracies further. Those conspiracies were then sort of picked up by some mainstream news media. So there was this cyclical effect. So various kind of examples, included that the allegation that the Black Summer fires, were started by arsonists, the idea that the preservationists Greens political party didn't support backburning and that therefore that party was to blame for the fires, and then more overt conspiracies like that so-called Islamists had started them, or just simply that climate change wasn't a contributing factor, or actually even going further, that climate change itself was man-made and a product of geoengineering and cloud seeding, things like that. So again, our analysis of Australian news media reporting was contextualised by a discussion of the historical role of coal and gas politics in Australia. So in this work, we were trying to, I guess, destabilise some of the false binaries of analysis which have been used to interpret different patterns of climate change response on the part of the far right. So sometimes you'll see a breakdown of accelerationists and denialists and the people who have resignatory attitudes described in different ways with different terminology, but without really looking at the literature, not necessarily looking at the connections between those different patterns of response and the ways in which they can give rise to one another. So we kind of tried to adopt an approach that was similar to or inspired by the work of a research group which is based in different places, but largely in Sweden, called the Zetkin Collective, who try to show connections between ideologies that they term eco-fascism, green fascism, and fossil fascism. So as part of this exploration, we showed how contemporary attitudes in Australia toward climate change have been critically shaped by the economic and social influence of its fossil fuel industries. So as part of this, it's important to consider, again, history, in this case, recognising how the influence of coal and gas on Australia's political elite dates back to the 60s, really, when minerals overtook wool as the primary commodity export. So coal and iron ore were at the forefront of this shift. And during this period, the mining industry's social licence was also challenged by Indigenous Australians who opposed mining on their ancestral lands, and also by environmentalists who were concerned about the industry's harmful effects on natural habitats. So in response to this, mining companies launched a strategic public relations campaign to try to semantically align their interests with the national interest. So they convinced Australians that their prosperity relied on the mining sector, that this was the type of economic sort of so-called development and progress that was desirable, and that therefore the activities shouldn't be restricted. So our discussion in this section of the book was really, in part, an account of how the mining industry was successful in its efforts. So without going into, I can go into more detail maybe in the Q&A, but our analysis really sought to explore how the influence of the mining lobby was bolstered by the pressure exerted by new right lobby groups, particularly with special access to government, like the Lavoisier Group. So we drew on books like Dominic Kelly's book, Political Troglodytes and Economic Lunatics, to explore the emergence of the new right and the sort of variously kind of reactionary and neoliberal sort of social campaigns which were advocated by different lobby groups, and how these were actually intersectional. So climate change denialism, advocated by the Lavoisier Group, was actually intersectional with other types of, I guess, emergent, more reactionary attitudes, which were connected as well to particular ideas around economic development. So the Lavoisier Group, for example, since the 80s and particularly escalating in the 2000s, sought through various tactics to try to delay meaningful action on climate change. In the way of sort of resignation and delay, you know, is also adopted by people who trend to the further right, and how these ideas are picked up, you know, by would-be sort of eco-fascist and far-right actors. So particularly we're interested in these campaigns and how the sort of tactics of disinformation also evolved to conspiracy again, and how they circulate across mainstream and alternative news and social media. So a final main analysis chapter in the book addressed the wider ideological and political context in which the far-right responses to the environment and climate change occurred in Australia and internationally. So as part of this discussion, we explored both institutional, intergovernmental efforts on the part of, so major governments and non-government organisations, to what's sometimes referred to as the Environment Security Development Nexus. But we looked at this alongside the sort of top level, alongside the sort of grassroots responses, particularly from groups of people that are sometimes defined as new catastrophists. So this chapter recognised how warnings that climate change may lead to ecological and environmental social catastrophe have grown more urgent from mainstream environmental institutions like the IPCC and the WMO, as well as the National Academies of Science across many countries. So the response to such warnings has been an outpouring of doomsday literature and proposals for systemic change, which we said sort of represented a new epoch in environmental thought, which could be labelled new catastrophism. So we didn't attempt in this chapter to either dismiss as erroneous or excessive the warnings of new catastrophists or others calling for radical and transformative responses to climate change, but we did try to represent a critical, hopefully constructive in some parts, reflection on these sort of more radical perspectives on transformative change in the ways that human societies might be organised, such that they might be less vulnerable to co-optation by the far right, but present meaningful alternatives. So the new in new catastrophism emphasises this contemporary awareness of climate change effects, distinguishing sort of the current wave of global heating responses from these so-called old catastrophism, which was associated with what is sometimes described as more alarmist environmental texts. So the earlier wave included scarcity debates that responded to the sort of well-known Club of Rome's 1972 limits to growth study, and caution as well about the supposed harmful effects of what's sometimes called sort of overpopulation, particularly in the global south, that was really popularized through texts such as Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, which sort of referred to his time visiting Delhi and referring to a perceived experience of overcrowding there, which was notwithstanding that, that there was greater population density in Paris at the time. So old catastrophism translated into radical climate solutions that could be vulnerable to exploitation by far and reactionary right groups, such as authoritarian environmental proposals set out in a book called Ecology and the Politics of Scarcity. And although overpopulation remains a primary issue for some environmentalists, new catastrophists tend to highlight the anthropogenic factors that are contributing to climate change beyond the population size. So they draw attention to the roles played by overconsumption, the burning of fossil fuels, the mining of essential minerals, and commercial activities which they see to be incommensurate with a sustainable planet, such as animal agricultural practices and deforestation, which is destructive to the natural environment. So we suggested that some new catastrophist theories can provide an ideological narrative that is vulnerable to exploitation by climate change accelerationists or by a resignatory or ethno-nationalist far right. So some new catastrophist texts might be said to foster also an ideological milieu generally within which far and extreme right social forces that exploit climate change might thrive. And this can happen through things like collapse theories that suggest that climate collapse, and particularly mass dying in the global south, is inevitable, or that this in some way represents a positive opportunity for remaking the world anew, usually with some greater degree of economic planning. So, but this is, you can see potentially for people familiar with these ideas of palingenesis on the far right, about sort of burning down a society, again, accelerationist ideas of collapse in the interest of really rebuilding that society along racial national lines. So these ideas of palingenesis, eschatological thinking, apocalyptic thinking as well, can in some ways not intersect, I suppose, but they can incorporate, I suppose, some of these sort of collapse narratives, which are now increasingly widely popularized as well. So the doomsday elements as well can sometimes take on a bit of a a kind of a more ethereal element, even if the ideas that are being floated by ideas like by climate scientists as well as new catastrophists are possible. So, for example, about the sort of so-called Venusification of the planet, the idea of Earth turning into a habitat like Venus, which is actually a possibility according to a lot of climate science, but the ways in which as well it's discussed in new catastrophist sort of literature as well, taps into those kind of other more eschatological, but also sort of ethereal doomsday elements, which are replete really in the accelerationist far right. And I can speak more about that in the Q&A maybe. So again, one of the greatest risks that we spoke about were the risks of consequentialism. And this was really where the ends were said to justify the means. And again, this was particularly a risk when looking at these some proposed authoritarian responses to climate change, which weren't actually, it's important to say, they weren't overt. And they weren't overtly being advocated in the sort of so-called new catastrophist literature that we looked at. But they were present in some of that sort of literature, and also the sort of risks of consequentialism sometimes, could be said to inadvertently err into those kind of authoritarian realms, which could, of course, lead to reduced democratic representation, particularly of further marginalised, disempowered people by global heating who remain to be insufficiently represented by states or apparatus to represent states, such as Indigenous peoples sometimes, or those people who are displaced. So intergovernmental and other institutional responses to the so-called environment, security, development nexus were also seen to emphasise risks associated with environmental stresses, particularly in the global south. We tried to show as well, and as I've written about in some other works as well, sometimes these responses can sort of overlook the reciprocal and related nature of violence and propaganda, which are communicated by different globally violent actors. And that's particularly in propaganda that leverages ideas about development and separatism and environmental catastrophe. So there are sort of relationships between the statements increasingly that are put out by these far right violent actors relative to neo-jihadists, and they actually tap into ideas around securitizing the global south, and also resignatory ideas about climate change devastation. So we also tried to show the ways in which the securitization of some precarious and vulnerable populations within that environmental security development nexus framework can sort of create further forms of precarity and vulnerabilities as well. So this chapter really, just to summarize, sought to show how new catastrophists and ESD literatures, both academic and public alike, they provide a dominant context in which far-right environmental responses can develop and which they respond to. So sometimes providing opposition, but also providing context as well. So they can normalize a sort of narrative and zero-sum logic that can inadvertently reinforce several tropes and fantasies of the far and extreme right. Particularly the unwavering certainty of some new catastrophist arguments, the sort of ubiquitous promotion of solutions claimed to be the only option for survival, can normalize a sort of an absolutist stance of my way or extinction, which might seem defensible if your way is radical localized democracy. I'm just reading a passage of what we've written now, but it also, is more dangerous when employed in the service of various alternative strategies or visions, particularly if it's re-enshrining sort of power disparities and inequities, which have brought about conditions of disparate climate impacts, devastation in less wealthy or so-called less developed parts of the world. Okay, so just to sum up, this is the last slide. So we tried to show how sort of eco-fascism, ecological fascism, ideas related to this is really rooted in social Darwinist perspectives on humans and the environment, and it inherently fosters an unsustainable ecological vision. So it's based on destruction and death and separatism rather than a holistic response. So largely those sort of ethno-nationalist arguments are important there. And it's also predicated on oppression and subordination, really, both in respect of different peoples and, in respect of relationships to the environment itself, rather than promoting lasting communal relationships between humans and ecosystems. We considered the arguments of critics of industrial capitalism, who emphasise the incompatibility of perpetual growth with healing the planet or achieving equilibrium as well. So in this way, we sort of tried to highlight how histories of development, as well as contradictions of capitalism, particularly in the Australian context historically, since colonisation, have contributed as well to the broader sustenance of some of these far-right ideologies in respect of the environment. So we argued then that fascism and the far right create and uphold these natural hierarchies, and they both stem from and they're supported by the widespread naturalization, again, of this rigid ideological belief that really hierarchy and competition and domination are those essential components of the human condition, and that those should be naturalized in this sense. So lastly, we attempted to show then that the Australian context, with its legacy of extractivism, white nationalism, does serve as a prime example of the importance of this context, influencing contemporary engagements with a restricted sort of exclusionary politics of climate change that has really global consequences. So we also aim to highlight some reasons for optimism and propose some avenues for change. So we emphasised how Australia, for example, gave birth to one of the world's first environmental political parties. It also inspired the world's first Green Party by name, and also numerous grassroots movements and campaigns have obviously been collaborating across communities for years to support and protect the natural environment. But we also really sought to emphasise throughout that regardless of the actions of colonial powers originating from the global north, Indigenous communities around the world have persevered and will continue in their centuries-long struggle to safeguard their homes and territories. So we sought to advocate that the challenges posed by climate devastation might be addressed by supporting localised responses on a larger scale, and instead advocating a globally collective and more inclusive politics based on land, place and public connection that would offer an alternative to far-right segregationism. And I think I'll stop there.
Well, Imogen, thank you so much for that fascinating presentation. I'd encourage everyone again to put your Q&As, the questions in the Q&A function, because we have time now for Imogen to answer questions about her book, about the presentation, or topics related to it. Maybe I can kick it off, Imogen. I was interested when you were discussing kind of the intersectionality of some of the various strains of far right and extreme right thought relating to the environment. And I was particularly interested in how you saw kind of either commonalities or differences between accelerationists and eco-fascists, because accelerationists, they're looking for a pretext for a collapse of the system in order to rebuild anew. In my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, those that espouse ecofascism are seeking for the protection of the land, even though it's a protection for a particular subset of people that they believe are connected to it, that blood and soil ideology that you're referring to. So I'm wondering if you had any thoughts about how those two ideas might collide or complement each other within far right thought.
Yeah. So there's been a few different ways of conceptualizing, I think, those connections. So Andreas Malm and the Zetkin Collective try to characterize these different currents as green nationalism versus eco-fascism versus what they call fossil fascism. And basically, I wouldn't sort of speak for their ideas, but as I understand them, which we drew inspiration from, the sort of ideas of sort of global, I guess, fossil fuel use, the things that we know to lead to sort of climate ill effects, to greater emissions, provoke displacements of people, provoke reactionary responses to that, a rejoinder such as we see. So green nationalism in the form of the politics advocated by Marine Le Pen, which is connecting, anti-migration sentiments with a response to, I guess, the devastation brought about by those forms of fossil fascism, which then also is leading to sort of eco-fascism, which is, again, advocating those accelerationist ideas of sort of societal breakdown. So just to explain that one step further, I think the I guess, extreme right currents of fossil fascism, as Andreas Malm and the Zetkin Collective characterize them, is that people are going to reject fossil fuel states. And so there are going to be greater authoritarian methods of population control through surveillance, controls on mobility, and other sorts of, I guess, bio-screening and that sort of thing as well, biosurveillance, which are likely to be implemented with the greater breakdown due to climate change. And that, so those authoritarian measures in themselves will constitute a rightward turn. Now, the thing that's strange about the Australian case is that through these things that we've tried to identify, particularly in our chapter about newsmaking on the environment and the sort of influence over time of lobby groups and the sort of developing of an ideological consensus within Australian society that sort of extractivist models of economic development and social development in some ways as well through institutions is good, and that is the desirable way, as opposed to maybe investments in research and development in other things, in other ways, that's actually desirable in Australia. And that's kind of unique a little bit, not singularly unique, but it is relatively unique on a global scale, I guess, given that we don't need those authoritarian, I guess, measures which are identified as in connection with the far right of fossil fascism, which the Zetkin Collective identify, because we already have that cultural consensus, which operates largely through the messaging about fossil fuel politics through the media, through the government over several decades. It's been a really concerted, careful campaign, and it's also buttressed and backed up by, as I said, these sort of extractivist ideas about the Australian territory and landscape. And even we see that in narratives to do with diggers, gold mining, pride in agriculture, the economic uses of the land are an important way, excuse me, a bit of a cold, of, I guess, reconciling as well those nativist and natalist ideas connected to sort of for the Australian context. So maybe just one more thing to say about that. I suppose that's important because obviously it is more the blood and soil ideologies of nativism and natalism on the far right. It's important to the far right. This idea that we own the land, have a spiritual connection to it by virtue of the uses of it, by virtue of the settling of it, as opposed to by virtue of perhaps a longer history of occupation of the land, as might be the case in, on the part of European identitarians and the European far right, for example. So in that way, that's one element of connection. In other ways, like I said, they slip over because of, I think, this utilitarian approach to propaganda in respect of the environment on the part of the far and the extreme right here, as in other places, which is really will go along with what works. Yeah, I don't know. Is that enough? Yeah. Oh, I think you're muted.
Thanks for that, Imogen. So we've got another question, I suppose, talking about different ideological strains of movements. So this questioner says, refers to a group like the Extinction Rebellion and saying that they always thought of them as extreme left wing. But your presentation has prompted them to think that maybe it might be a right-wing movement or it's not an easily defined movement. So are you able to comment a bit on that in terms of how other movements that are not typically classed as the far right are emerging or responding?
Sure. So, I mean, it's difficult defining left and right when you're looking at these types of, sometimes we're seeing groups that potentially would describe as extreme left, which is not Extinction Rebellion. I wouldn't. But extreme left groups being radical environmentalist groups which have done significant damage to property in the North American context, for example, and other groups who might seek to bring about revolutionary violence in order to overthrow a system. And sort of the extreme left environmentalism has found its ideological justifications for supporters on the basis that it wouldn't, and I hope this slightly goes to the question, on the basis that they don't do damage, that they might damage property, but they won't risk harm to people, especially the lives of people. But now those arguments are, and this is not really the main focus of the book, but we did speak about it a little bit. Sometimes those groups are taking on these more misanthropic humans of the virus type elements as well, and there are actually real risks which are starting to emerge from things like train derailments, for example, that do risk harm to people, which has not been the case with the so-called extreme left as we might define them in, I'd more call them eco-extremists. I think maybe it's not, I certainly wouldn't call them right-wing. I think there's a whole lot of, and that's these groups I'm talking about, not Extinction Rebellion at all. I think maybe I should just respond to sort of the mention of Extinction Rebellion. So as far as I understand, one of the policies of Extinction Rebellion is radical non-violence, and giving, for example, gifts to law enforcement, the sort of this kind of ultra sort of pacifist in a way approach, which is actually has a lot of, it really doesn't seek to, in any of the expressions really that I've seen, has sought to garner a mass movement, not for the purpose of overturning any social or political system, and certainly not using violence to do that. So for those reasons, I wouldn't really even call it extreme. But of course, extreme means a different thing to everybody. We all have a different definition of that. So yeah, there are anyway interesting crossovers. The types of ones that we were focusing on were more the fascist first, but there are actually some of these kinds of crossovers. But I think we need to be very careful when trying to call something far right or far left. And sometimes it's not that useful, really. It might be more appropriate to say eco-extremist. But certainly what I'm interested in is the development of explicitly exclusionary and supremacist and racist ideas, for example, and separatist, I suppose, ideas. And to that extent, those are right-wing, you know, and that's not what's advocated by groups like Extinction Rebellion. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thanks, Imogen. Well, I just want to thank you again for a really interesting presentation. It's given us a lot of food for thought. It's clearly an issue, you know, in your response to the last question, that is drawing some kind of interesting responses, I think, from a wide spectrum of actors. And it's one of those issues that I think, as you say, kind of breaks down our traditional notions of where things sit on an ideological spectrum. If you're interested in the book, Imogen has kindly said that, you know, to feel free to get in touch with her. It's also published by Routledge and can be found, and I believe through that website. And also the paperback copy of the book will be available later this year. Is that right, Imogen?
Yes, the cheaper paperback version will be available later this year. But if you want to contact me, I can tell you where to buy it, or you can just find it online. Yeah.
Wonderful. So want to thank everybody again for joining us for this webinar. I also want to quickly say that we have our AVERT International Research Symposium coming up. The call for proposals is out, but the deadline for the proposals is fast approaching, which is June 3rd. And I'd encourage anyone working on the issues that we're taking a look at. The theme of this year's is People, Places, and Spaces, New Dynamics and Shifting Responses to Violent Extremism, to consider submitting a proposal for our symposium this year. And more information can be found on our website, which is avert.net.au. So once again, thank you to Imogen, and thanks everyone for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you at our next AVERT webinar, and more information on that will be through our mailing list and website shortly. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.